Ever since I was a little kid, all the older men in my family would take me fishing every opportunity they got. It was like some family ritual. I, being the youngest, meant that I was next in line to become an expert like all of them claimed to be. The ones who took it the most seriously were my dad and his brother Eugene. Our houses were decked out like the ones you've probably seen on fishing shows. I won't go into detail, but if you took a step into my house, you'd instantly be able to tell my parents spend more time on the water than on the land. This is actually his story, not mine. My dad's a pretty hard guy to scare, but let me tell you, whenever he tells the story, it's like he's a different person. He doesn't like talking about it, but every so often at a family gathering or a special occasion, one of my relatives will ask him to tell it, and he will. My dad's name is Gwyn. He was fishing with my uncle Eugene and their close friends Clytus, Dylan, and Lagan. They had set out early before the sun had even broken the horizon, heading to a remote spot they had all agreed was prime fishing territory. This place was a couple of hours boat ride from the nearest marina, tucked away in a secluded cove-type area that few bothered to explore. It was known among them for its abundant bass and the occasional pike. The day started like any other fishing trip, with the boat cutting smoothly through the mist rising off the water, everyone sharing stories and jokes over the hum of the engine. They anchored the boat in a familiar cove surrounded by dense forest. Lagan was the first to crack open a beer, even though it was so early in the morning. My dad tells me all the time that Lagan is his wild friend, the one who tends to drink a little more than he should. They fished for hours, the only sounds being the occasional splash of a lure hitting the water and their own laughter, and the occasional crunch of empty beer cans that they were drinking like water. As the day wore on, they had their fair share of catches, each one sparking a small celebration. As dusk approached, the light began to wane. A dense fog rolled in from the water. My dad describes it as the boat literally being swallowed by fog. Clytus, who was the most experienced fisherman of the group, kept saying that he had never seen fog so thick. That's how unnatural it was. Dylan, the jester of the group, was almost as drunk as Lagan, both of whom were seemingly unfazed by the fog that had ensnared them. It was starting to get dark. They had originally thought that they could just wait out the fog, but it didn't seem to be going anywhere. My dad and Clytus agreed that Eugene should just try to drive the boat out of the cove and into the open ocean, where the fog probably wouldn't be as dense. Eugene agreed, but even though he was typically the most cautious, he only narrowly avoided colliding with the shore. He refused to risk further damage to his prized boat. They reluctantly came to terms with the fact that they'd probably have to spend the night on the boat. My dad made the point that they'd need to tell their families about the situation, and of course, they had drifted into an area of the cove that had no signal. My dad needed to handle some business at work, so neglecting the problem was not an option. He offered to go ashore in search of a signal, and Clytus and Dylan said they'd join him. Eugene would stay back to guard the boat and an increasingly inebriated Lagan. My dad, Dylan, and Clytus made their way over to the shore and jumped out of the boat, only getting slightly wet. My dad made a point of snagging the emergency flares in the boat, just in case they got lost and needed to signal Eugene to come find them. The three of them made their way into the pitch-black woods, lit only by the shine of their phone flashlights. My dad and his friends have all done their fair share of camping, so it wasn't like a forest scared them too much. They began trekking uphill, hoping that higher ground would give them a better chance of finding a signal. My dad always made a point of emphasizing how dark yet eerily foggy the forest was. You could practically feel yourself slicing through the fog just as they were adjusting to the dense atmosphere. A series of strange clicking noises began to permeate the silence, first emerging from directly in front of them before encircling them completely. These sounds were unlike any forest sounds they were familiar with. It was rhythmic yet erratic, as if someone was tapping out a code meant only for the woods themselves. The distinctiveness of the noise made one thing clear: it was human-made. The realization that they weren't alone hit them like a freight train. Clytus, the most seasoned of the trio when it came to outdoor survival, whispered urgently for them to turn off their flashlights. "Don't give away our position," he hissed, with a note of genuine concern in his voice. As the lights switched off, the darkness became thicker than the fog. The clicking noises stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence that seemed to weigh on their chests. Time lost meaning as they stood there, frozen, unsure of their next move. I'm sure they were all thinking the same thing. The idea that they might have stumbled upon some kind of clandestine gathering or a woods cult was terrifying. Then, as suddenly as it had stopped, the silence was broken by rustling noises, this time much closer. Then silence again. And then a guttural scream echoed through the trees, a sound so primal and full of anguish that it rooted them to the spot. Before they could process what was happening, rapid stomping noises thundered through the woods towards them. The three men took off back the way they had come, acting on fear and pure instinct. My dad fired the flare gun behind them. The flare cut through the fog, lighting the woods up for a moment. The woods were as clear as day, and the sight that met their eyes was nothing short of horrifying. Illuminated by the flare's red glow was a pack of more than 10 individuals dressed in what could only be described as tribal attire. Some of them brandished wooden spears, but the light from the flare only lasted a split second. Dylan screamed and almost stumbled, but Clytus quickly grabbed his arm to keep him upright. My dad describes this part as the most overwhelming feeling of pure terror he has ever experienced. The forest seemed to fight against them as they fled, ducking under branches and jumping over roots. By some miracle, they emerged from the tree line, panting and disoriented but alive. They screamed at Eugene to start the engine, the urgency in their voices leaving no room for question. Eugene complied immediately, and the boat lurched forward just as their pursuers reached the shoreline. In the chaos, my dad fired the last flare into the air back towards the shore. For a split second, as the flare's light pierced the fog, they saw their pursuers at the water's edge. It was freakish. There must have been at least 15 of them just standing motionless at the water's edge. The flare's light faded, and it was dark again. Eugene managed to get a safe distance away and stop the boat again. After the engine was off, the only sounds were Dylan, my dad, and Clytus's breathing. My dad says he wasn't able to process what had happened for nearly an hour. He was functioning off pure adrenaline and survival instincts. They ended up taking turns keeping watch while the others slept and left first thing in the morning as soon as the fog dissipated. Funnily enough, Lagan had passed out before everything went down and doesn't remember any of the details of that night. I still get shivers down my spine when I tell this story. I can only imagine what my dad must feel when he thinks back to it. Far from civilization, nestled deep within a remote valley, flowed a river teeming with life and death in equal measure. It was said that the spirits of those who had perished in its unforgiving currents still haunted its banks, seeking vengeance on the living who dared to trespass upon their domain. Among the bravest, or perhaps the most foolish, was Nadia, a thrill-seeker with a penchant for danger that bordered on obsession. Determined to test her mettle against the river's legendary inhabitants, she embarked on a solo kayaking expedition, heedless of the warnings that echoed in her ears. As she navigated the treacherous rapids, Nadia felt a chill wind sweep down from the mountains, carrying with it whispers of the past and the promise of doom. Ignoring the sense of unease that gnawed at her insides, she pressed on, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and excitement. But as she rounded a bend in the river, she was greeted by a sight that froze the blood in her veins. A spectral figure, pale and ethereal, drifted silently upon the water's surface, its eyes glowing with an otherworldly light, fixated upon Nadia with a hunger that sent shivers down her spine. Paralyzed with terror, she watched as the figure drew nearer, its form twisting and contorting with each passing moment. And then, with a sudden burst of speed, it lunged forward, its icy fingers closing around Nadia's throat with a grip that stole the very breath from her lungs. Gasping for air, she fought against the spectral assailant, her paddle swinging wildly as she struggled to break free. But the spirit's grasp was unyielding, its grip tightening with each passing second until Nadia could feel her consciousness slipping away. Just when all seemed lost, a blinding light pierced the darkness, driving back the specter with a force that sent it shrieking into the night. Blinking away tears of relief, Nadia found herself face to face with a figure bathed in radiant light, a guardian spirit come to her aid in her hour of need. With a gentle touch, the spirit guided Nadia to safety, its presence warding off the malevolent forces that lurked within the river's depths. And as she emerged from the water, shaken but alive, she knew that she would never again tempt fate in the haunted waters that lay beyond. There's a nice hidden lake a short walk away from my house in Parson Field, Maine. I've been going fishing there for as long as I've lived here. It's hidden away from any roads or houses, it has perfect privacy, and I would always be the only one out on the lake fishing. In fact, I would leave my kayak in the same spot by the lake whenever I wasn't using it. It was easier than lugging the thing back and forth through my house to the lake anytime I wanted to use it. I would leave it leaning up against this huge tree every time. The kayak is heavy enough to not fall over from a windstorm or anything. I also leave it covered to prevent critters from taking refuge inside. It was a warm summer's evening. I was out on the lake already for about an hour and I'd caught a few trout already, which I'd thrown into the cooler. It was dusk at this point, the little bit of light left in the sky was disappearing behind the trees. I was going to bring it in soon and just then, I heard sounds from the edge of the lake. I turned and saw someone standing at the edge of the water, tipping a barrel of some kind over, pouring its contents into the lake. It looked to me like they were polluting the lake with something. I took it upon myself to yell out, "Excuse me, what are you doing?" The person looked up at me and then ran into the woods with the contents of the barrel still pouring into the water. I looked more closely at the liquid being poured out into the lake, and it looked like a dark red liquid, though it was dark out, so I can't say with 100% certainty if it was red, but it was very dark. I felt a sense of unease creep up throughout my body. I decided I wanted to leave. I'm a big nature guy though, and seeing people littering or polluting the environment makes me sick. I genuinely couldn't resist shouting something out to that person, but I didn't feel comfortable here any longer. I planned on reporting this to the Department of Environmental Protection. I paddled the kayak back to my usual spot. I took all of my gear off the kayak before pulling it out of the water. As I was putting the cover over the kayak, I heard one single snap of something not far away, like the crunch of something under a person's shoe. I turned and was about to say, "Who's there?" but I decided against it. I finished covering the kayak quicker than I ever had before. I didn't even bother standing it up to lean on the tree this time, I left it on the ground. I picked up my gear and cooler and started quickly walking out of the woods and out to the road which led to my house. It was only a couple minutes of a walk and I was back home. I kept looking over my shoulder the entire time, thinking someone was behind me. I put my gear in the shed real quick, then went inside. I never locked the doors so quickly. I was genuinely spooked. I rinsed off the trout and put them in the fridge, planning on cooking them tomorrow. Tonight, I just heated up some leftovers. As the food was in the microwave, there was a knock at my front door. The fear and dread that I was feeling the entire walk back to the house returned in an instant, and my suspicion that I was being followed home was basically confirmed. I mean, who else would be knocking on my door this late? My lights were on, my car was in the driveway, whoever it was knew I was in here. I had all the shades closed though, so nobody could look inside. They knocked on the door again. The microwave beeped as the timer hit 0. I'm sure whoever was outside heard it. All the windows were cracked open and a moment later, there was a knock now on the window and a man's voice said through the window, "Excuse me, I think you saw me at the lake earlier." I'd just like to explain myself. There was absolutely no chance I was opening the door to this person. For them to stalk me to my house told me this was a dangerous person. They repeatedly knocked on the window and kept yelling, "Hello," through it. I decided to acknowledge him now that he was getting more aggressive. I yelled, "Yo, leave or I'll call the police." I intended to either way, but it was still a threat to get him to leave. The man responded calmly now, saying, "Sir, if you could just open the front door, I'll explain everything to you." I repeated my threat, and I didn't hear his voice again. At this point, I shut and locked every window in the house and turned on the AC. I also made a report to the non-emergency police number, detailing both the barrel being dumped into the lake and the man coming to my house. I also made an online report with the Department of Environmental Protection. Making these 2 reports honestly made me feel a little better about going to sleep that night. But thank God I'm a light sleeper. In the middle of the night, around 2 a.m., I heard a crash from downstairs. I immediately sprang out of my bed and grabbed my Glock from the closet. I heard someone's attempt at quiet footsteps coming up the creaky wooden steps. I had my Glock loaded in hand as I stood behind my dresser right by my closet, aiming at the door. I heard very slow creeping towards my door. My bedroom door is closest to the stairs, so it was naturally the first door that they would approach. And sure enough, I heard the doorknob slowly press down and then the door pushed open. I saw nothing but the man's silhouette enter the room. I flicked on the lamp next to me so he could see my gun, and I screamed, "Get on the ground now." He raised his hands in the air and seemed for a second to be motioning for me to calm down. He had a small blade in his hand. I told him to drop it, but then he said calmly, "I'm leaving," and he turned and ran for downstairs. I yelled at him to stop, but he clearly took the chance on me being too afraid to pull the trigger. I heard him leave through the front door. I ran downstairs to lock the front door right away and then called 911. My living room window was shattered, glass was all over the floor. I kept my sight on that broken window until the police officer showed up. I had to explain that I already made a non-emergency report of what happened earlier, in fear of waiting too long by morning for the barrel to be gone in the darkness. I went with 2 of the officers who showed up to my house to where I saw that man dumping the barrel into the lake, but after 20 minutes of walking around looking for it, it was gone. The man must have made sure not to leave it behind. I gave my best description of the man to the police for their report. The man was a short, bearded white man with a receding hairline and glasses, wearing a black flannel shirt and black pants. After the police left, I stayed in the living room all night with my gun next to me, watching TV. No way in hell was I going to sleep with a broken window and some nut job out there. At dawn, my brothers came over to help me fix the window. My brother Azaria stayed at the house while my other brother and I went to Home Depot to get the window and parts. Azaria stayed at the house with me for a few nights till things cooled down. My not-so-wild theory is that the barrel contained human remains, possibly dissolved in some kind of acid. Why else would that man follow me home and then break into my house to potentially murder me? Trust your gut if something feels wrong. I knew if I opened my door to that man, something terrible might have happened to me. This happened in the early summer of 2020, right when COVID was at its peak. I'm sure most of you can relate to staying at home during quarantine and not being able to go out. With the constant boredom of staying locked away inside of my house, I decided to take a day for a fishing trip. I live in South Florida, a place where it's notorious to go fishing. My state was still on lockdown, but I didn't care. I drove about an hour's drive away to Key West and went under a bridge to where I was sure I would get a decent catch. The waves were a little rough, but it didn't matter. Fast forward to about 30 minutes later, I'm still fishing, waiting for a bite. I look to my left and see what appeared to be a blue tarp setup behind one of the pillars of the bridge. I thought nothing of it, but for whatever reason, I looked back and saw a man standing there looking at me. To be honest, he kind of startled me as I jumped a little bit and nodded my head as a hello. However, he didn't seem to acknowledge my greeting as he kept staring at me with this blank expression I couldn't even describe. By the looks of it, he looked homeless, worn, torn clothes and had a full-on white beard, kind of like what you would picture as your typical old fisherman. What made me unsettled, however, was that his right hand was always behind his back. I pretended to concentrate on fishing, but I could still feel his gaze looking at me. Suddenly, he then jumps into the water and is swimming directly toward me. Even with the rough waves and the current from under the bridge, he was extremely fast. I was out from under that bridge in less than 15 seconds and got in my car with my foot glued to the gas pedal. I also left my stuff behind as, obviously, my life was more worth saving than that. I drove about a few miles where I stopped at a gas station for a snack and then proceeded to go home. What that man was going to do to me or what he wanted, I don't know. I assumed he was probably a dangerous homeless person who didn't like people near where he lived. The next day, I drove back to the bridge and tried to get my stuff, only to find it gone. Not only that, but the blue tarp and the man were also gone. Nothing was left except for an old hunting knife left on one of the platforms where the pillars were held up. After seeing it, I knew that's probably what he was hiding behind his back. Thanks for watching the video. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to watch the latest videos.